So hello and welcome. In today's podcast, we're going to be looking at, initially the difference between personal safety and self-defense, which I know is always fairly confusing and fairly contentious. And to help us with that, we've got Scott Whelan, who is a long-standing friend of mine. He's been involved in law enforcement for over 20 years and has a deep understanding of both these concepts and the importance. But yeah, welcome, Scott.
Thank you so much, Darren. Thank you.
Cool. First and foremost, what's your background? Where do you fit in all of this?
I'll keep it really brief, which you'll be thankful to hear. I was involved with martial arts from a very young age, all the way through to my teens, became an instructor, started teaching self-defense after trying different martial arts, identified gaps in the market around effective personal safety and self-defense, even from a young age. So some of the research I did, there were people teaching people self-defense with judo throws as part of a membership fee. Females were given sharpened combs to carry as a weapon, and none of it felt right or fit for me. I developed a self-defense program that encompassed personal safety techniques in addition to self-defense techniques. And there is a difference between the two. So during conflict or a period of conflict, the self-defense aspect is the then and now. In that moment, when there's a physical confrontation or a verbal confrontation, that's when self-defense, tactical communications, that's when those aspects are key. The personal safety aspect is the broader umbrella, which goes across the entire timeline leading up to that event and post, and that includes the trauma management aspect. So I've been involved with martial arts from a young age. I went into law enforcement to try and do good, to try and protect people, to try and make a difference. I know it sounds very cliche, but that's why I did it. During that time, I gained even more experience around conflict resolution, personal safety. I became an instructor within law enforcement, teaching officers how to defend themselves, how to act appropriately. And from there, I further developed my self-defense program.
Okay, so personal safety is you taking into consideration the things that affect you and the situations that you might face in order to avoid having to go down the self-defense route, which is the hands-on bit, the bit that you really don't want to be involved in. But if you find yourself there, it would be quite useful to know at least a little bit about what you can and can't do.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is that fair?
It is fair. And I think where the confusion comes from, and I've been guilty of this in the past, in my younger years, you become hyper-focused on techniques. So if suspect A or offender A does this to you, these are the techniques I can do. And there is some value in that, but it's a very small aspect of personal safety. What I learned over the years, managing and supporting victims of crime, teaching in the community, in schools and other social settings, is actually there's something really key that people need to understand before that bit even happens. And that's what happens to the body during conflict. And I use the term conflict, and that can apply to physical confrontation or verbal confrontation. So an argument, somebody shouting, etc., somebody going hands-on. And in that moment, there are some key physiological responses that the body goes through. And what happens mostly is that people freeze. And for years, all people ever discuss is fight or flight. So people can hypothesize about what they would do in a certain situation. And people are very honest in those moments. And they would say, well, if this happened, I would run. Or if this happened, I would definitely fight. And that's the mindset people get into. So when conflict does occur, the most common response is freeze, that people don't talk about. And then people shut down and panic because they've done neither of their plan. So they haven't run, they haven't fought back, they've frozen. But actually, that's the key aspect to the start of understanding effective personal safety, is identifying that will be the initial physiological response, but it doesn't mean it's over.
Most people will go into a moment of freeze, whether it's, I presume people freeze for different lengths of time. So for some people, it may be an instant, so it doesn't look that long, but there's still an element of freeze. Or do some people skip freeze, or does it happen to everyone? That's a better way of asking, I suppose.
No, that's fine. The majority of people in conflict will freeze momentarily, the majority. Now, clearly, some people will react straight away with either fleeing or fighting. That is a thing. But actually, the unspoken one is the freezing. Now, without going down the road of sexual offending, it's a very common response in sexual offences with victims. And that's a self-preservation tactic. A victim of a sexual offence will freeze rather than try and fight back and feeling like they're too vulnerable or have the means to escape. So freezing is very common in that. What happens in the freeze aspect is that unless you understand why your body's doing it, people then just give up and they think, well, that's it. I'm not doing anything. And they will continue to talk themselves out of either talking to the person, trying to do something tactical to withdraw. And the whole premise of self-defense and personal safety isn't to win a fight or come out on top in terms of conflict. It's about creating time and space so you can withdraw yourself and get to a place of safety or people of safety to try and preserve yourself. Nobody wins in conflict. Nobody wins in assaults and fights and all these other things that happen in society.
So I read that the freeze aspect is nature's way of hiding you from a predator.
Absolutely. It's
You
been
stay
ingrained
desperately still, you don't breathe, and hopefully you won't be noticed and you'll get away with it. It will bypass you.
since the dawn of time. It's a tried and tested technique in early man to let the predator not see them and walk on by.
Okay, so you get that free. Most people, I suspect, listening will have had that rush of adrenaline at some point. And is that, or a rush of adrenaline, is that different for different people? You know, that flush feeling. I certainly, whenever I've had a rush of adrenaline, it's like a flush feeling that runs through you, and it's a strange feeling. I mean, you get to recognize it, I suppose, but I bet the first time it happens, if you haven't had it properly.
Well, that's the key, because in those moments of freeze, you get that rush of adrenaline. Your body's preparing itself. That's the other way to look at it, that you are, it's described as the freeze aspect, but your body's going into preparation mode. You know, what am I going to do? Am I going to tackle this threat face on, or am I going to run? And your body's preparing. So that rush of adrenaline goes into your central nervous system. You start becoming focused on gross motor skills. So if you put somebody under stress or in conflict and ask them to do, small tasks like write their name or do a jigsaw, you won't be able to do it because they're fine motor skills. But your body's preparing to activate your shoulders, your core, your legs to either run or fight. And you get that tunnel vision. So you get that hyper focus on the person in front or on something else. Auditory exclusion. So suddenly you stop hearing things like that are happening around you. You become focused and hyper focused on the threat. Now that generally happens to nearly everybody in those moments. It just depends on your kind of next steps after that, about what happens, whether you continue to freeze and do nothing because you've given up, or you employ some tactics to get yourself safe.
So we've obviously trained together, and we've developed exercises where we've put people under a degree of pressure and stress or a new situation. It doesn't have to be particularly awful for people to go, actually, this is new and I'm feeling the stress. And we've seen that element of auditory exclusion where you're there as the instructor or perhaps a participant with them, and you're talking to someone who is focused on a task, whether it's, I don't know, first aid or whatever it happens to be, but that they appear not to be listening to you. And that's an example of auditory exclusion at that point. So if we know this is going to happen, and we know that there's that rush of adrenaline, we know it's gone to gross motor skills, everything's switching off and shutting down. One, I suppose, there's an element of us recognizing that in the individual. But as an individual that starts to recognize these signs in them because they've conducted training and therefore they go, oh, I know this happens to me and I have a degree of understanding how I'm going to react. How do they not go through that phase of auditory exclusion? How do they not get tunnel vision?
Well, the reality is they probably will, because by the very nature of conflict and physical confrontation or verbal confrontation is normally unexpected. It's above the baseline. It's out of the norm. We're creatures of habit and routine. So when this stuff happens, we have a natural physiological response to it. By educating people, by training people through personal safety and self-defense, through heat training, so if they're traveling abroad, or even some really functional travel safety training in this country, people get to understand about what their body does. As soon as you start to understand something a bit clearer, you automatically feel like you've got an enhanced degree of control over it. If you feel like you've got more control over something, you start to feel more confident. You start to engage the brain again, start to make decisions about what to do next. When we feel out of control or we don't understand something, we will freeze and shut down and try and assess what is happening. And periods of conflict or aspects with physical confrontation are incredibly rare. So I know that through the training that we do, I like to make it abundantly clear if I'm delivering training to a room full of people, the chances of somebody being involved, say in the UK, for example, of some severe or serious physical confrontation is still quite rare. Verbal confrontation, threats, abuse, that sort of stuff is a slightly different aspect, but the same principles apply. It's the same if somebody starts verbally abusing you randomly in the street or in the workplace or somewhere else, your body goes into a similar physiological response. You know, it might anger you, it might upset you, you might want to withdraw, you might want to confront, but I can guarantee in that first few moments, you'll freeze and assess what's happening.
And looking at the verbal aspect then, is the human body reacting at that stage thinking, actually, this could get worse than it currently is? Is that what the preparation stage is? So the person has been verbally aggressive. Is my next thought, well, that could escalate to being physically aggressive?
Absolutely.
That's why we're going through that stage.
And
Okay,
even in the workplace where you know that's probably not going to happen, the cognitive part of your brain knows that physical aspect's probably not going to happen, for example. It's still a physiological response. It's a response to that shock, that stimulus, that verbal aggression. It's the body's natural way. I mean, I'm very thankful for it because outside of those environments, it often does develop into something more physical. And so your body's preparing to keep yourself safe and to do something productive.
So again, this I'd like to look at then, the flinch reflex, because wouldn't it be great to train out the flinch reflex? I think was something for the 90s. Where do we stand on training out that flinch reflex that we have?
That was one of my favorite bits when I conducted research over 2 decades ago in some of the martial arts and self-defense that was being delivered, is that you'd have people in darkened rooms and instructors would jump out and try and frighten them. And the whole premise of the training was to stop them from reacting and bringing their arms up or reacting. I mean, it's the most ridiculous thing. One really effective aspect of personal safety and self-defense is just to embrace the flinch. If somebody jumps out at you, your hands will automatically raise up. They'll come up towards the command center, towards your head. That's the area that you naturally want to protect is your body. So somebody jumps out and you bring your arms up. That's fantastic because your hands are then in the most perfect position to defend yourself if need be. And the good thing is, because of the freeze aspect of the physiological response, you're not necessarily automatically just striking out. Because sometimes friends, family, loved ones, we're all foolish sometimes and play tricks on each other. And there is something ingrained in us that gives us that momentary ability to assess a situation. But the flinch reflex is one of the best things that can happen to a human response. Your hands normally come up or they go out in front or you recoil back. Either way, you're naturally starting to create some space. But again, this falls back into that freeze aspect. So your body's naturally doing this. If you understand what it's doing and why it's doing it, it gives you that element of control. And we'll circle around back to confidence fairly shortly, I'm sure, throughout the duration of this podcast, because confidence and perceived confidence is the absolute bedrock of effective personal safety, I would say.
So there's a classic video, I can't remember if I've sent it to you now, of me at my kitchen window being filmed by one of my neighbours who then jumps up at the window. And apart from making a pretty high-pitched squeaking noise, I don't know what it was, definitely didn't come from me, but my hands came up. And I should probably post it, maybe not with a squeaking noise, I might just edit that out. But
you see it in stadiums, there's videos that do the rounds on social media of bats flying into the crowd or a ball or something else, and suddenly someone just instinctively just puts their hand up. But you watch the people who are aware and the people who aren't aware, and the people who are aware when it suddenly happens all naturally recoil and putting their hands up because that's the bit they want to defend. You can take a bit of impact to the body, but the head is something that you naturally want to protect. And luckily, you don't have to think about it because generally that's what you will do.
Presumably, so you're protecting, you call it the command center, not just because your ability to think, but because that's where your mouth and nose are. So that's where you're going to breathe. That's where your eyes are. So, you start to take those things away, then it becomes problematic in itself. The brain, yes, the command center, but actually no breathing, no seeing, and suddenly things are slightly awkward. You've talked about it in the past. I know you've spoken, I want to call it spear.
Yeah, there's The Tony Blauer system in America. So he revolutionized some law enforcement training, the SPEAR program, which is spontaneous protection enabling accelerated response. And the whole idea of that training was he based it around the flinch reflex. So actually, when your hands came up, your hands were then in the perfect position to do something else. Now, that training was more specific and unique for officers in law enforcement, in particular armed officers who perhaps carrying firearms and needed that ability to be able to use another hand to create some space or defend themselves if they were carrying firearms. But actually, the same principle still applied to self-defense and personal safety. You embrace the flinch reflex, and then you convert that into the effective self-defense in those moments to create time and space. So we cover off the techniques, the effective techniques, and I describe them in training as, they're not pretty to look at. They're incredibly effective, but it's fairly ferocious. It's fairly relentless. There is no single technique in those moments that's going to resolve it for you. So there's a series of techniques to vulnerable striking areas that we cover that is within the ability and capability of nearly everyone who embarks on a self-defense or personal safety journey.
Okay, so that's what I want to touch on next, because I know that you are specifically motivated around the area of gender safety. And certainly with Emetha, your company, that is as I understand it, that is the primary focus. And part of that is the myth busting aspect of, well, the individual is significantly larger than me, 21 stone person grabs me in a bear hug and carries me off, then what am I going to do about it anyway? I've added a couple of possible myths for you to bust just there for you. We've talked about the freeze part now. Based on that, what's the next stage, the fight element? You've touched on it just then, but what happens at that point? Or is there a point in between that we haven't touched on? Have I jumped ahead?
Well, it's a timeline that I like to think of it as. But if we focus on this bit for now, as you've asked me, so it's really important that once we accept what our body's going through in those moments, we're assessing the threat and risk. Good time to do this when I've got a cold. We're assessing the threat and risk. The key aspect at this point is to have a clearly defined line in the sand. And this is what I deliver to people. So if you are in a situation where you're feeling uncomfortable, let's keep it low level. You're feeling uncomfortable. Let's focus on gender specific. So advances from a male towards a female. So you're starting to feel uncomfortable, but you're trying to be polite because actually that's quite a good way of diffusing a situation. You've said no, or you've asked somebody to leave you alone politely, and they don't listen. Then already you're thinking, okay, this is heightening my perception of risk. Now, again, in those moments, you start to feel uncomfortable. You start to get the slight dump of adrenaline because you feel like this is over and above your normal baseline, this potential risk here. There is the perceived vulnerability with the strength and balance, say if it's a male and a female, but you need to make a decision around what you're going to do. So once you've told somebody no or to leave you alone, that happens again. It's firmer. It's more instructive, no. And then you've already decided that's your line in the sand. If anything else happens after that, you need to do something. And that doing something is simply just walking away, for example, in that situation. It's not worrying about the perception of coming across rude because we're all quite self-conscious in the public setting, whether it's work or in society. And embarrassment is a really high risk for most of us. And we don't want to feel embarrassed. We don't want to be accused of being rude or anything else. But actually, if somebody is treating you in a way that you wouldn't treat somebody else or in a way that you feel uncomfortable, that's it. That's your gut instinct. Your gut instinct is telling you this is wrong. It doesn't matter objectively what other people think. Subjectively, that's how you feel. You need to act on it. And most of the people I've worked with over the last couple of decades, I'm not victim blaming here, but they haven't listened to that initial gut instinct.
I think that's we do tend to do that. We always assume, actually, this will probably be okay. That's quite normal, isn't it? Just to go, no, I'm sure this will be fine.
And most of the time it is fine. And this is, again, we'll circle back to, look, these things happen. You have interactions with people, strangers. Most of the time it's fine. But actually you have to have in the back of your mind where your line of the sand is. How do you keep yourself safe? And it's fine to have that, to have your own values, to have your own ethics, to have your own self-preservation.
So you're talking about having done that threat assessment, you've already rolled scenarios in your head. I'm not saying that every time you go out the front door, you need to go, right, quick threat assessment. We kind of do that naturally as we go. But if you've at least considered the things that you consider to be your key vulnerabilities, then you're one step ahead because you've kind of processed how you're going to deal with it. It goes back to that planning stage. You've got at least something that goes, okay, I never expected to find myself in this situation, but I have played it in my mind, or done some. And I'm not trying to sell the training, but if you've done the training, then at least you've talked these things through. You will have looked at aspects of it. You'll have looked at examples, presumably, of how these things generally happen, because there must be stats and metrics for all this stuff out there. So you're talking about walking away. Where do you walk to? Because if you're going through this adrenaline dump, you're dealing with it. You've got what? Tunnel vision at this stage, beginning, or
Yeah,
already
in the
fully
early
kicked
stages,
in. You've got
absolutely.
auditory exclusion. How do you assess which way to go? I mean, you go from one danger straight into the next, or you place yourself in a position where actually, holy smokes, I'm more vulnerable now than I was a minute ago because I've just walked myself down an alleyway.
Yeah, I
I mean,
mean,
that's
in those moments when the key aspect of this is to make an early decision. The earlier you make a decision and have that line in the sand, the more in control you feel, the less time you are in that moment of freeze where you've got that adrenaline surging through your body. As soon as you take control and understand what you're doing, then you start to get that back. Now the adrenaline starts to go, and we can talk about that afterwards, as in the post-conflict stuff where you get the heavy legs and sometimes people feel a bit sick and all of the things. But in those moments, you make that decision and you think, right, okay, this has happened. If this person comes to me again after being told twice, I'm leaving, because that's the first obvious tactical response. And you do it with confidence. And I'll come back to the confidence thing. But when I talk about confidence, I mean, you deliver with eye contact. So if you are creating space, if somebody's in your personal space and you politely told them to move away, or you've politely told them no, or you've politely explained why you don't want to have a conversation with them, then you've done your bit. That's more than reasonable. Now, if they breach that, it's with confidence, it's with eye contact, it's more assertive, it's more definitive, it's back off or something similar. If they're then going to breach that, there's a problem there. You know that there's risk.
okay. So you're assessing, because a normal person comes up to you, they get it wrong, how they've walked towards you. And I don't know, they're asking for what time is it? Who does that these days? But whatever. Their engagement is seen as inappropriate by you, and you say, nope. Most people would go, I've crossed the line there, whoops, and they'll back away straight away. It's when they don't that that's a warning, because if someone is not recognizing your discomfort, then that's problematic. That's telling you that actually their intentions are perhaps not what they've initially used as a break-in conversation, or whatever it happens to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And, there are difficulties and challenges around some of the gender differences in these situations. Working with females over the past 2 decades, there's an element of, if I come across as rude or dismissive or assertive, it's going to make them or him more aggressive, and it's going to be worse for me. So if I can keep it low key, if I can keep it soft, if I can negotiate out of it, that's better for me. Whereas the reality is, in the head of an offender or suspect, they see that as a perceived weakness and vulnerability that they want to exploit. Now, offender methodology, that's what they're looking for. They're not looking for confident people who are assertive, hold themselves tall, make an eye contact. They're looking for the people that they think they can overpower, whether verbally or physically, but it's generally verbally to start with, whether they can intimidate somebody, prevent somebody from leaving just through conversation alone and through intimidation. And again, you come back into the victim mindset, and there is this aspect of, if I keep it soft and low level, I won't make a scene, it won't be embarrassing, I won't make it worse for myself. But the reality is that just comes across as feeling unconfident and
Okay,
vulnerability.
so go back a stage then. What is most likely to put us on the target list of an offender? What are they looking for in their victim? And what can we do to avoid, drop ourselves down that target list?
Well, let's look at robberies, for example, and let's pick a fairly stereotypical area where an offender would operate. So say a busy train station or somewhere similar, a crowded space. From an offender's perspective, they're scanning the crowd. They're looking for perceived vulnerability. So they are not looking for and paying no attention to the people who are walking, who look like they know where they're going, even if they don't. But their eyes are up. They're making eye contact with people. They haven't got their head buried in a phone or headphones in. So an offender is looking for someone who clearly looks nervous, who clearly looks uncomfortable in a public setting or doesn't know where they're going, might have headphones in, might have the head just buried down in the phone, head down, not looking at anyone, and just making a beeline for something, whether it's taxis or into the town. And they will pick them out really, really quickly. And I've seen dozens and dozens of CCTV footage of this happening. And then they'll approach. And generally, in those situations, people have this perception that a robbery is, hugely explosive and people jumping out and grabbing and producing weapons. It doesn't happen a lot in the UK. It does happen, but not very often. Generally, they'll be stopped with something inane, like I'm sorry, where's the train station? Or can I borrow a phone? Or have you got £3? I can just anything to try and break their process of where they're going. And then generally in that situation, because of they're feeling nervous already, they want to come across as rude, they want to be embarrassed or cause a scene, they'll stop. And as soon as they stop, the offender's generally got them in that moment and can normally kind of coerce money out of them with very shrouded threats. And it can escalate to physical contact and force. But in those moments, it's easy pickings to them. And I've seen and investigated these robberies that have happened over the course of 10, 15 minutes. And victims have been walked to cash points and back again. And there's been no weapons produced. There's been no aggressive threats of violence, just very calm conversations and control that way. And that's generally how those sort of offences will start. But if you're in a public area, and even if it's somewhere you haven't been before, the key is to have this level of perceived confidence, because that's what offenders are looking for. They're looking for a lack of that. And you won't be picked on.
So the headphones, I mean, you only have to go onto, a high street and everyone is going to have headphones on generally. And how much time do we spend, looking down at our phones? A fair bit. But if we can avoid that in a situation that is new to us, then
I'm really reluctant to tell people, because it starts to head toward kind of victim blaming. But you're absolutely right. It's not necessarily having headphones in or looking at your phone, because like you and me, I rely on it for everything. And if I'm somewhere new and I need to check something, I'll quickly check it. But if I'm pulling my phone out in a really public area, I'm doing it in a considered way. I'm not being obsessed about it, but I'm just mindful about where I do that. And I'll have a look at the information I need to get and I'll put it away, and then I'll carry on with where I need to go. Looking at people, shoulders back, even though inside I'm thinking, well, I don't know where I'm going. And the worst case scenario, if you really are turned around and you've got no idea where you are, and I discuss this with people who are traveling to foreign airports or to public spaces in this country, if you really don't know where you're going, rather than stopping still, pulling out a phone, looking completely out of place, just head to the nearest, what I would deem place of safety. And that's going to be a coffee shop or a restaurant or a supermarket or something else where you can go and stand. There's staff there. You can pull out your phone. You can figure it out rather than in the public space. It's just those moments of like, near place of safety, somewhere safe. I'm going to go into that shop. I'm going to have a look around. I'm going to just calm down. I'm going to figure it out and then go back out and do what I need to do.
So I was talking to a cop yesterday for completely different reasons. I wasn't in trouble, by the way. But we were talking about phone theft and something I hadn't thought about. And I've seen plenty of videos of, the moped, the grabbing the phone, or the runner, just banging it goes. And he said, you'll walk on the side of the road where you're heading towards the traffic. It's more likely. I'm not saying always. They'll sometimes bump the curbs. But then the next thing was to have your phone in the hand that is on the wall side, because there's obviously significant less space for that individuals to get into that area of your phone for the snatch. And it's just little things like that. Now, I know that's not always going to work, but I guess if if you want an easy life as an offender, you just go, not that one. Excuse me, you're giving it to me now, thanks. That's just making that a bit harder. Okay, so well, I hope it didn't come across as sounding like I'm victim blaming. I'm not doing that at all, or trying not to do that at all. I'm certainly not my intention. So we've got the freeze part. We know what the body's going to go through, or certainly as an individual, we start to consider that. We've already assessed the kind of the threats. We've then worked out how these things might happen. It's not going to be someone bear hugging us and throwing us down. Have we got time to go into, are we going to do strikes and things like that now? Or is that for another episode?
That'll be for another time, I think. But I think the bit I really want to just cover off is that aspect straight after the freeze, before it even gets to that point. And it's going back to that line in the sand again. And it's difficult without covering off every crime type, without every situation. But the most important thing to do in those moments, I think if there was a couple of takeaways from this podcast, it's in any moment of conflict, there will be an aspect of your body just shutting down or feeling like it's shutting down while you're preparing for what to do next. It doesn't happen to everybody, but it happens to the majority. And it's not talked about enough. Like I said at the start, it's just fight or flight, fight or flight. And as soon as somebody does neither, they panic and think, well, that's not for me. So your body will probably go into freeze momentarily. Know that and accept it. And as soon as you accept it and understand why it's happening, you get some control over it. And then you make a decision. Generally, people will initiate forms of attack through communication. That's how it starts. The bottom of the scale is a communication. If they can get some control over you through communication, through intimidation, that's how it generally will start. Not always. Sometimes they're very spontaneous. And that's when we cover the physical self-defense stuff, the techniques are incredibly helpful, because in those moments, when we go back to that flinch reflex, we help train people and educate people what to do in those moments of conflict, those extreme violent situations. But actually, the majority of attacks will start through communication. They will start with very low-level contact. So it might be physical contact, a hand on the arm. It's almost like boundary testing, like a toddler. Well, I can do this now. I've stopped this person in the street through words, and I've touched their arm. That's fine. They're looking like they want to go. I've just taken their hold of their wrist really gently. And the whole time, from the victim's perspective, is, well, this isn't an assault. That doesn't hurt. I don't like it. I feel incredibly uncomfortable, but it's not an assault. So I can't do anything. But also I can't leave because they're kind of holding my arm, and now they've positioned themselves in the way that I want to go. So I don't want to go back because I'm going to look silly. And we talk ourselves completely out of doing something that our gut is screaming at us saying, just leave, just leave. So there'll be the freeze moment, and then there'll be the clear decision making that you need to just make a decision. And that will need to be, you're looking for a place of safety and a means of escape. And that's before we even get into the realms of self-defense and physical defense and techniques.
Okay.
Most people talk themselves out of that window of escape, as I like to refer to it as, where you can leave. There will be no embarrassment. There will generally be no follow-up from the person, because actually you're showing a degree of confidence and decisiveness, and they don't want you. You're going to cause a scene. You're going to get them arrested. You're going to get the public intervening. So they will simply drop you like a hot potato and unfortunately move on to somebody else.
Well, thank you very much. This has been awesome. I think we'll look forward to the next episode is actually talking about, well, those self-defense techniques that you're talking about. I think there's a belief on the part of many that if someone is significantly larger than them, then there's nothing they can do. And I'm hoping you're going to absolutely bust that myth for us. I don't believe it's true, but I'm sure you're going to have slightly more evidence and proof than I certainly got. So cool. Thank you very much. Good luck with Emitha. I'm looking forward to seeing that as it goes. Yeah. Catch you later. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for having me.
Cheers. Bye-bye.